systems. The Zim dollar has been devalued drastically, which raised the cost of imports and sent inflation to above 750%, although I've just seen June figures. I think for June, the annual inflation rate amounted to about 732%, which is still sky high. Investors rushed to the stock markets, but the government of President Emmerson Mnangagwa then decided to suspend the stock market at the end of June. And he recently went a step further by threatening to suspend or eject Old Mutual from the stock market. Old Mutuals also listed in both London and in Harare. And in the meantime, a humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Zimbabwe as food and fuel prices are soaring and citizens are finding it difficult to feed themselves. Today, we are lucky to have two guests from Zimbabwe, and let me introduce you to the first one. The first one is Professor Tony Hawkins. I'm just going to go through all of you that you can say a little bit about yourself. You've got it there on the screen. Professor Hawkins, can you give us a little introduction about yourself, please? Oh, please.
Well, it's all written there, so but yes, I'm an economist and a commentator on the economic scene here, and I'm hearing a lot of echo on my machine.
Yeah, I think we should just check. Are you using an earpiece or not? Okay. Before you start talking, I'll see if I can get Stuart Lohman, our general manager, to fix that. You just got to, if you use an earpiece, we just need to. I'll see if we can fix that. And can we then go to? Well, we will staying in Zimbabwe first, and we're speaking to Sean Gammon. Sean Gammon is the managing director of Imara Corporate Finance. And does that describe you? Would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think just to say, just for background for people who don't know, Imara is the longest standing non-banking financial services business here. We've been involved in stockbroking for over 60 years, and also in corporate finance, asset management, and fiduciary services. So, you know, I've been in this business 22 years. I've worked in many of the parts of the business here. So it's a kind of broad experience.
Well, that's really good for you when we're discussing the stock market. And we also got, oh, look, I have there. We've got Tara O'Connor from London. She's the managing director of Africa Risk Consulting. Tara, can you introduce yourself? And you know Professor Tony Hawkins, I believe.
Yes, I do. It's very nice to share a panel with Tony, who was formerly my editor and long-suffering editor as many years ago. But actually, my role in this discussion is really to look at the outside-in view as a risk management consultant, which I have been doing now for 25 years, and looking in particular at what the issues are that face businesses when they consider investments in countries like Zimbabwe.
So, and I hear you'll be really good to tell us about migration figures from Zimbabweans leaving for South Africa as well.
Yes, well, maybe out of date, but with COVID, but nevertheless, yes.
Well, what we always do is it's interactive. We're inviting now our business community. Please type your questions in the questions bar on the webinar. As I said, we've lost Stuart Lohman because of a power failure in South Africa. But we will field questions, but we will also discuss the main issues. And I think questions to Tara would be political risk, investing. Should people invest in Zimbabwe? What are the risks? And I'm also going to ask her about, you know, people would also always ask, what about South Africa? What's the influence of that? And with Sean, we'll discuss the stock market and questions mostly of that to him. But, you know, they both in Zimbabwe know a lot. And Professor Hawkins, we will ask questions about everything. I just want to make sure, Tony, we just need to look at that feedback on your mic. So I'm going to start by, I think, with Sean. Sean, the stock market, what is happening there?
Well, the short answer is that the market was suspended roughly two and a half weeks ago. The initial calls for it to be suspended came from the Ministry of Information, which doesn't have jurisdiction over the market. But obviously it was more of a general view of government and probably the party that the market needed to be suspended. I mean, I think the reason why it came through that ministry at the time was that the main directives at that time were regarding EcoCash, and EcoCash being used as a mechanism for making payments, and the stock exchange was sort of tagged on. But we have a situation now where we are 2.5 weeks into total shutdown, and there's been no formal communication from government in any way of the reason for this. There's been discussion around the fact that the market is being used for speculative purposes, and the market has been performing very, very well in nominal terms, but that's just inflation driven. There's also been discussion that certain of the ratios that were being derived from the market were being used by people to set prices and adjust prices, and therefore influence inflation and influence exchange rates. And when you hear that, you know very quickly that they're talking about the old mutual implied rate. I think this thing has been, yes, but you know, the old mutual implied rate is really just looking at the difference between the price of Old Mutual PLC on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange and what it's trading at in Johannesburg and London and Malawi and Namibia and all the other places where it trades. We actually started using the OMIR, as it's called, sort of about 15 years ago, shortly after Old Mutual was listed, and it became quite clear that there was a disparity, and we started using it as a measure for what people were expecting or not expecting exchange rates to be, but what the reality was on the ground outside of controlled exchange rates. And the OMIR was used all the way through the bad days of hyperinflation, and has been used since then. So you know, it is as it has that I in it. It's an implied rate, but it's very clear that the government feels that it is the mechanism that is driving the parallel rate. And so that is what we believe, and we read into why the stock market has been shut down. Quite why they didn't just make a move to suspend Old Mutual trading, having already suspended fungibility of it and putting an vesting period on trading on it over the last 12 months. Quite why they didn't just stop Old Mutual and the other fungible shares from trading and leave the rest of the market open, nobody knows. And it doesn't seem that there is any direction for how we move forward and out of this.
Okay. I've discovered Tara, the feedback comes from your mic. Would you do me a favor when Tony speaks? Can you mute your mic while Tony speaks? And we're just going to ask Tony to please comment on that.
Okay.
Okay. Just for a second. We'll just see if that fixes it. That's my feedback that I got from Stuart. Professor Hawkins, what's your comment on what's going on in Zimbabwe, the reasons why they are doing this?
Well, I think Sean has set it out very, very comprehensively. The authorities are preoccupied with the public relations of economic management. They want people, market players, potential investors, if there are any, and I don't think there are very many, to believe what the government says rather than what is actually happening on the ground, what the markets are showing, and so on. And it seems to be a very heavy-handed approach to talk about, the exact phrase was evict Old Mutual from the financial system, which includes its subsidiaries like one of the country's biggest banks and so on. And to use the closure of the stock exchange for 2.5 weeks and for that purpose doesn't make any great sense. There's no sense of economic strategic management here. The fact that on both these occasions to which Sean referred, first the announcement came from the Ministry of Information. Second announcement came from ZANU-PF party, political party. We didn't hear from the Minister of Finance. We didn't hear from the Governor of the Reserve Bank, and so on. So it seems to be a preoccupation with believing that if you control the exchange rate, you can reduce inflation and stabilize the exchange rate as a result. Well, you know, if inflation is running at 730% and it's going to go up, and if the money supply is doubling in 6 months, as it has, you're not going to slow inflation. You can do what you like with Old Mutual and the applied rate and so on, but it's not going to achieve anything other than a temporary hiatus, which is what has happened now.
Okay. Tara, can you put your mic back on, please? And from a London point of view, from an investor's point of view, how does this look?
Well, I mean, I think I was called and asked about this this earlier, and it just, as I think Tony and Sean have actually very clearly outlined, that it just shows that actually Zimbabwe has now moved into a state of economic abnormality. There is nothing normal about closing your stock exchange and in the manner that it has been done. And it sends the absolute opposite signal that any normal investable environment would want to send, which is that we're open for business, our left hand and right hand know what they're doing, and that we have a clear economic policy that will take, I mean, particularly at a time that we are in at the moment, where you actually are in the midst of a COVID, an international, a global health pandemic, you know, that really should, to all intents and purposes, should be the focus of government activity at the moment. And there will be enough drama around facing that crisis, rather than piling on more drama by doing something like this, like shutting down the stock exchange as a mechanism to control the currency.
Okay, right. Before we get to some of the questions, especially for our two people in Aurora, what is it like on the ground? I mean, how are citizens experiencing what is going on at the moment? Any of you, Sean or Tony, please.
Well, I think if you're living in a country where we would guess that GDP is falling about 15% this year, it will have fallen about a quarter over the 2 years, 2019, 2020. You've got less than 700,000 people employed in the formal economy. We've probably lost 50,000 to 100,000 jobs this year. Difficult to tell. You have a situation where the national minimum wage is 2,500 local dollars a month, and the poverty datum line for a family of 5 is about $8,500 a month. You've got real wages have fallen dramatically. You have shortages of things like fuel. It's very difficult to get the local currency in notes if you want them. Not that many people do. Much of the business on the ground, even if you go to an informal person selling flowers or coal or firewood on the side of the road, he or she will quote you in US dollars. Something like 50 to 60% of bank account deposits today are probably in US dollars. So although government says the economy is not re-dollarizing, it very obviously is. and it's a matter of time before we formally re-dollarize and become and the local currency becomes even more residual than it is already.
Sure. Okay. Wow. Okay. That sounds. Oops. Sorry, everybody. That camera went off. Sean, how do you speak to other investors? You speak to stockbrokers. How do they view this, and how do they view what's going on the ground? I mean, I see bankers, doctors, nurses. They all want to be paid in dollars now, American dollars.
Yeah, I think that's the case, but we've been through this before. That's in some ways the tragedy of it. The situation that's going on now is very similar. The inflation's not quite the same level, and there's some aspects that are a little bit different from what happened in 2008. But we have been through it before, and you know, about Zimbabwean crisis, it's not this week. It's been going on for a very long time. I think that, you know, everybody has, when I talk about other brokers and operators in business here, it's you wake up in the morning and decide what you need to address, and you get on with fighting the good fight as well as you can. You know, I think from the investor's point of view, I'm more worried about that. I'm more worried about the bounce back ability of the stock exchange for foreign investors going forward, because we've now gone through such, you know, when we went through 2008, the market shut for 3 months at the death of the Zim dollar and got going again in US dollars. We had foreign investors that had been active in the market, buying that market up to that time. And they went through that crisis and they came out the other side and they ended up making money. I just think that so many of those people have been bitten so many times now by Zimbabwe that the bounce back ability is not there with investors as strongly as it has been in the past. And there I'm talking specifically about the stock exchange. I think FDI and things like that, with a wholesale change of economic regime, if it ever comes about, you know, there's very good opportunities. Everybody understands that. But I think that portfolio investment will be quite slow coming back this time.
Okay, I'm gonna open the floor now for everybody to ask questions. Just want to ask Tara, how do Londoners, how do international investors see it? Where do they think Zimbabwe is going this time?
Well, you know, as Sean says, you know, we have been here before, and in fact, funnily enough, I think it's this week last year I was actually in Harare giving a presentation. And the irony is that they had to ask me to come in, and the organizers asked me to come and give the presentation about the local situation, because they were unable to source someone local who would be prepared to stand up and tell it like it is. And I'm afraid I did. Then I met a group of young Zimbabwean business people who had been through 2008 before, but now were 10 years or 15 years older, you know, a little older, and with family responsibilities, school fees, mortgages, and that sort of thing, who were resoundingly miserable about what they were going to do next, because it was such a repeat, but without an apparent without an end, with no apparent end in sight. So, I mean, I think, you know, the real issue for Zimbabwe is really competition in the region, and I'm not talking about South Africa necessarily, because you know the international investor community is now much more sophisticated about and much more knowledgeable about Africa, because there is competition between countries. If you even compare Kenya and South Africa, you know, Kenya is a thriving economy. Obviously, this is pre-COVID, and hopefully will be the same case after COVID. But a very pro-free market. You can go to Kenya, find your capital, find a stock market, find your professional services advisors, all there ready to help you. And you know, you would go to Kenya not to just be in Kenya, but to invest in Ethiopia or in Uganda or Rwanda, you know. And similarly, for new emerging markets opportunities, even a country that's got a similar history to Zimbabwe, like Angola, run by a liberation party, you know, it is in the middle of a massive ideological transformation where even yesterday it announced that it is privatizing a whole host of state-owned assets and doing so because of COVID in a digital way. So modernizing, forward-looking, bringing, even in a crisis, trying to bring new investment in, and critically tackling state corruption right at the top with the trial of the son of the president. So I'm saying that there is an awful lot of competition for very scarce investment funds at the moment, and you know, with this sort of behavior and a lack, as Tony and Sean have said, of any kind of recognizable investment plan, why would you go to Zimbabwe? Apart from that, in the long term, Zimbabwe has got, obviously, is greatly investable. You know, it has got a great deal of, its fundamentals are all good. Its government is bad.
Okay, I'm going to go to the questions now because I think there's a lot of questions that come in. I think it's just fair to our business community. And I'm quite honored to have Ray Hindlovu from Bloomberg News asking a question to Sean. He says, what options are available to Old Mutual to the order from ZANU-PF that it should be compulsorily delisted by the Zimbabwean Stock Exchange? In other words, what options is there to Old Mutual? Sean?
I'm not sure how to answer Ray's question because there's a lot of muddled thinking in the proclamations that have come out of the government and the party. To talk about delisting a company is different to talking about suspending its trading. Suspending its trading pending an investigation is something that happens on a regular business on markets all around the place. To compulsorily delist a company, I'm not even sure that there's a legal basis for doing that. If you want to delist a company, it's difficult enough to do it from the right reasons. So I'm not sure quite what is meant when the policymakers or these people have talked about these things. There was talk also of establishing the Victoria Falls US dollar stock market and trading Old Mutual there. Well, we can move Old Mutual to that market once that market's up and running, but that market won't be up and running for quite some time. And how does that then impact in terms of somebody that owns an Old Mutual share now and wants to sell it and buy a Delta share? Well, they can't do it because the Delta share is not in Victoria Falls Exchange. So there's a lot of detail that needs working out amongst all of those things. And that's really all the kind of input I can have there is really to say that there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding. We need to be very clear about what people are suggesting. Victoria Falls Exchange is something that we as brokers would ultimately welcome if it is something that can be put in place for raising regional capital in US dollars and is ring-fenced in US dollars. But there's a long way to go before it is up and running. The very logistics of trying to set up an office in Victoria Falls haven't been thought about by anybody. So there's a long way to go before that market, I think, is in place. Although in theory we would welcome it because we welcome any opportunity to have a trading platform.
That's an interesting view. Would anybody else like to comment on a possible stock exchange? Is it at Victoria Falls? Professor Hawkins?
Well, I would agree with Sean. If you wanted to set up a regional stock exchange in this part of the world, I think Zimbabwe would be one of the last places you would want to do it, given our track record. I think that is the problem. Clearly, Botswana, which has got a relatively unblemished record, or Mauritius, if you're talking about an already sophisticated, much more sophisticated than here in terms of financial services industry, or of course South Africa itself. But the idea that a country like Zimbabwe, which is a very poor country, in fact, if you look at the numbers, one of the worst performing sub-Saharan economies over the last 20 or 30 years, it's not really the place you're going to want two stock markets. And why do you want two stock markets anyway? I mean, it's all because you don't want to face up to the reality of what is happening to the exchange rate and the mismanagement of inflation and the exchange rate in this country.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of questions, quite detailed questions about that. There's somebody says, are foreign currency accounts usable to transact in Zim and not misused or claimed? That is from Ken Butchard. Anybody knows about that? Sean, is that your area of expertise?
Possibly more Tony's, but
Okay, Tony.
I'm not sure on the tradability and usability of them. I haven't had a personal experience with it.
Tony, do you know about that?
Well, yes, they are tradable. They are working relatively effectively. The problem I think people are having is accessing US dollars in currency and notes, because partly because of COVID. It's difficult to get the notes into the country and so on. There is another problem which has been arisen because, again, of government, in that it is creating a sort of a second tier of a foreign currency account. It's promised to pay civil servants and pensioners, government pensioners, not private sector ones who've been pretty much wiped out anyway, but the government pensioners are going to be paid in US dollars, allegedly. In fact, the money is going to be paid into a foreign currency account, but it's not going to be accessible in cash. You're going to have to use a card, or you can use presumably internet transfer to pay it to another foreign currency account. But that means you've now got two tiers of foreign currency account, one which is more liquid and tradable than the other. And this, I think, can only lead to problems in the medium term.
Okay, and this is a question specifically for Tara. It's Helmer Prayers. You probably know him because he says, hi, Tara, what is the progress in terms of foreign investment in mining, as in February of 2018? When he was there was a lot of excitement about the potential. And I've just seen a story from Bloomberg that Zimbabwean's biggest gold mines are being snapped up by a Mauritius-based Sotic International as the price of bullion soars to the highest in more than 8 years. So, question for Tara, please. Hi, Tara. You got that? Is your mic on?
Putting the mic on.
Okay, the mic on, please. Yeah.
Hi, Helmo. Yes, there has been no doubt, actually, even since since Robert Mugabe was ousted, that unleashed a huge array of new interest in mining and new investment in the sector. But in a sense, a lot of that I would be, as with my compliance and with my compliance hat on, I would question how people are actually getting those licenses, because and so on, because I do think that there is a real issue now with the ZANU-PF government actually being deeply compromised as it is, and very, very much gone rogue. I think while snapping up opportunities very quickly because the gold price is going up, still doesn't leave investors' responsibilities towards good governance and ESG aside. And you may be storing up problems for later. But I absolutely agree with you. There has been a flurry of interest in the mining sector, some more successful than others. I've heard mixed reports, some actually waiting an awful long time for government decisions. And that also raises questions why you're having to wait so long for government decisions to be made.
Okay, well, that sort of goes into something that somebody else asked me. Email questions was why does Old Mutual appear to turn a blind eye to Zimbabwe's political problems? Is that right, and is it now paying the price for that? That's a bit of a loaded one. If anybody wants to answer that.
I'm happy to answer that question because yes, it has been, you know, again, it's one of these things that is now very much part of the issue of companies that do business with Zimbabwe, is that with its human rights governance and the government's general track record, there is a question mark over of actually how one does business. You know, where business and governments meet, I would put Zimbabwe in a high risk category. So, and beyond that, I think that Old Mutual is rather different in that it's been in the country for 120 years, and it does also have responsibilities to its pensioners and so on. You know, but certainly being such a prominent part, and I think you know, it actually owns a considerable stake in Zimbabwe, does raise reputation issues, and how Old Mutual manages those reputation issues in Zimbabwe is a question for its shareholders.
Okay, let me just go. There's a question for all of you. Yep, sure.
Can I just comment on a couple of points there? I agree with what Tara is saying. I think it's not just Old Mutual who's in this. There are a lot of, but there are a number of major companies, other internationals, who have had to decide. Barclays Bank, for one, which left, who've said, well, okay, we're going for whatever reason. Others have had to trim their sails to manage the risk here and the reputational risk that Tara's talking about. Very difficult, but you know, it is a choice. You either stay or you manage the risk, and one way of managing the risk is to go. I think the second point I would make, and this is just a somewhat nasty one, I must say, is you just look at what's happening in Hong Kong, where certain banks and other major internationals are trimming their sails to suit the new order, and so it's not just specific to Zimbabwe. It is an international problem, and the way things are going, it's going to become worse rather than better as we go forward.
Yep, that's a very good response. Thank you. There's a question, they quite link these two. There's people who literally are asking, why do the electorate keep on tolerating ZANU-PF? That comes from Brian Hawksworth. He says, yeah, practically what happens to Zimbabwe as a country and people living there if this continues, this trajectory? And that's Diane Spurlander, and Brian Hawksworth wants to know, why do they tolerate, you know what's going to happen to Zimbabwe? And the people who have been suffering under Mugabe thought there was a bit of a bright spark. I don't know if people thought that, but a little bit brighter with Mnangagwa, that promised they opened for business, and now it's back to, it seems, almost where it was. Anybody like to comment?
I'd be very happy to comment again. Sorry, gents, to jump in here. But I mean, I think there has been, you know, when you see, I mean, I spoke to a Zimbabwean colleague not so long ago, and the levels of violence that that are meted out by the powers, the authorities around times of election, the human rights abuses, the opposition beatings and so on. These are things that when, as Tony says, it happens in Hong Kong, we all get very fired up about it. But actually, it's been going on so systematically, and when you have a member of the opposition who has to actually flee the country immediately after elections, you realise that again, this is not a normal, yes, when elections occur, they're not managed in a normal democratic manner. And I would, when I was there last year, actually going around seeing actually how people manage in a hyperinflation, to manage from the beginning of the day to the end of the day, to actually feed themselves. And as Tony said, made some very good comments about actually the level of average wages versus the poverty level. When you're dealing with that, what young people do in Zimbabwe is you leave, because the only way that you can sustain your families in a reasonable manner is to earn money outside of the country and pay remittances. So, and as a result, I think after the last elections, you were asking me about figures. I think something like 800,000 young people again left the country to go into Zambia, to South Africa first, but to then find their way all over the world to bring their brilliance and hard work to other economies, and sadly not their own.
Yep, that is sad. The same thing with South Africa. Some people leave as well. Can we ask this possibly to Sean or Tony? What does the picture look like for pensioners in Zimbabwe? What do they try to do to cope financially? Asked Jackie Cameron. That's our editor.
Well, I think that obviously, anytime you have an inflationary issue and a hyperinflationary issue, inflation is a government tax on the public, and if you are in an employed status where you can adjust to it, that's one thing. But pensioners, generally speaking, can't adjust to it. So, hyperinflation or inflation of the measure that we've got just means that people on any kind of fixed income at all, and pensioners are obviously the most obvious ones there, have that totally wiped out in terms of the pension that they're seeing in the dollars they're seeing in their pension pack every month. There's been a lot of talk about the pension funds themselves and whether they've invested appropriately or not. The one thing I would say about a stock exchange, which is the area where we're the closest, is that the stock exchange has generally kept up with inflation over a long-term period, but obviously it has those spikes and those dips which take it away. We should be grateful for the fact that we have such a developed exchange, and it is quite well developed relative to the rest of Africa, because it meant that during the period of over 08 and into 09, there was some value that was preserved by the stock exchange. But for your average pensioner, it's extremely difficult. I don't think anybody watching this will have to look too far away to find where there's ways that they can give support to pensioners. There's a bunch of relatively old guys, even older than I am, who's cycling around Harare at the moment to raise money for old people. So all of those things are there, and but it's hard for pensioners at the moment, no doubt.
I can imagine. So Sean, do you know what is going to happen with the case with Old Mutual? Is it just a threat, or are they definitely going to do this? Can anybody jump in there, Sean or Tony?
Yeah, I think it's far too early to see. I think the only thing that we've seen that is concrete is that we have had, as a firm, we've had investigations from the stock exchange, looking at the trading that we've done post the period that there was a vesting period put on Old Mutual trades. And we believe that they are going to all of the other brokers and doing similar investigation to see if they can find any wrongdoings there. That's the only thing that we absolutely know in terms of timing and in terms of process. But apart from that, the problem is that there has not been a single statement out of the Ministry of Finance or the Securities and Exchange Commission or the Stock Exchange on what the actual problem is. So, you know, we sort of shoot in the dark here.
Okay. Do you want to comment on that, Tony?
No, I just agree with Sean. The silence of the bodies, the institutions who would normally have been involved in the Old Mutual decision is quite striking, and one gets the impression that there's a fair bit of disagreement within the ranks of within the corridors of power, if one can call it that.
And here's an inevitable question, and this is the question that most of the questions that I was emailed was this question: do you see any parallels with South Africa? Is the decision making very different, and is it a different country because of our judicial system? Some people asked, is it different because of our constitution? Anybody can jump in. Tara, I think your mic is still off. Just put your mic on again.
Go on,
So I'm
Tara.
quite happy to take that one.
I knew you would be.
Okay.
So because we get that, you know, it's the what I call the Zimbabwe question, which is whenever I actually give sort of a talk on South Africa, I get the Zimbabwe question, which is, are we not just going to end up like Zimbabwe? But I think, you know, there is a very fundamental difference, I think. You know, I mean, Tony, you can talk about the size of the economy and it's, you know, it's a much, it's not comparing like with like. Where it is similar is that you again have a sort of nominally liberation movement that is still in power. But what is very different is the you know, the constitution in South Africa that took such a very long time to work out and thrash out, and which has stood the test of time. The extraordinary thing, you know, if there were to be comparisons made, you know, South Africa would still be governed by Jacob Zuma, and that is not the case. You know, the system has worked. Not only that, the judiciary has worked, the constitutional court is working, and we are seeing the slow restitution. You know, despite the attack by Jacob Zuma on the institutions of the constitution, they have withstood their first fundamental test, and we are now seeing the building up of cases of corruption against the perpetrators of corruption. You know, we need to see more of that in South Africa for it to be a long-lasting trend. But definitely, I think the constitution in South Africa is a totally different kettle of fish. It was arrived to it by very different means, and I think it has withstood its first real trial.
Anybody else like to comment, or shall I move on to the next question?
I'll just say, you know, how much I agree with Tara. I would just add an economic dimension, if you like. I think there are similarities between Zimbabwe and South Africa in the sense of very high levels of unemployment, very high levels of inequality, not in the normal sense. In Zimbabwe, the main inequality is between prosperous, a very small but prosperous indigenous minority and the average Joe in the street. South Africa is similar but different in numerous sort of ethnic ways. But both of the countries face very serious long-term problems in terms of generating enough jobs, in terms of what climate change is going to mean, because the region is going to be drier and agriculture is going to be much more difficult. These are the sorts of issues that I think where there are similarities. But I think Tara's point about constitutionalism is absolutely critical.
Okay. Well, for the time that is left, I think it's just fair to talk about the way forward. And Chadwick also says, what's the way forward for Zimbabwe? How can the economy be saved? So if we can have everybody's view on that. Sean, would you like to start? How can we save this situation? If it's savable?
I think that obviously a lot of people have pointed to Zimbabwe's great natural resources and that sort of thing. So we know that there's great opportunities for the country, and we have a fairly hardworking and honest labour force, not as well educated as people always go on about anymore, but it's still there. But I think the issues that we're looking at from the economic point of view cannot be solved entirely in Zimbabwe. And there is a need to reach out and embrace the rest of the world. And it's very clear that the pathway towards doing that is not involved in economics, it's not involved in business, it's political. And so the need to move forward in terms of humanitarian, in terms of electoral reform, in terms of all of these things, has been very clearly spelled out in terms of the IMF programs that we've looked at and things like that. We need to do those things and have those things in place so we can move forward with debt relief, and so that we can then become part of the international community again. So, you know, those are hard decisions for anybody to make from a political point of view. But, you know, our basic belief is that the underlying economy in this country is still pretty resilient and has that strong bounce back ability. And we also believe there is a lot of goodwill in the international community for Zimbabwe. We just need to be able to make those steps to start unlocking it.
Okay, Tara, would you like to comment?
I would. Yes, I would. I would totally agree with Sean on that. You know, first and foremost, that the long-term future of Zimbabwe is absolutely there's absolutely no doubt, given where it's situated geographically, its natural resources, its human capital, all of those things make it a super would-be investment destination. But politics is in the way. And unfortunately, one of the very big issues.
Sorry, Tara, you're breaking up a little bit there.
You know,
oops,
get some political resolution that reaches out to the international community. Nothing can be done without debt relief, and debt relief will not come unless Zimbabwe is able to persuade the US Congress and therefore the IMF that it has taken sufficient democratic humanitarian steps to transform, and that leading to debt relief. One hopes in a way that COVID will also push that along. But until that happens, and unfortunately I don't see any signs within ZANU-PF of actually coming to those reasonable conclusions. So unfortunately I think it's going to be, you know, more downside before upside in the long term.
Okay, can we have Sean, last comments on the way forward? And how do we get out of this situation?
I gave mine.
I think it's Tony's turn now.
So it's Tony.
Okay, Tony, go for it.
Well, you know, I very much endorse what both Tara and Sean have said. There has to be some kind of international bailout, rescue package, whatever you call it. That looks to be a long way away at the moment because of the reasons that Tara referred to in terms of local politics. The concerns that I have about the longer term have to do with the kind of damage that has been done over the last 20 years. You know, there are not many countries in the world that have gone through 2 hyperinflations in 15 years or whatever. And still, and we go back to a question that by one of the questioners, they said, why does the electorate keep on voting for this government? And that really is a problem, a question I can't answer. I wouldn't even try to answer. But normally you would expect the people to be influenced by their economic plight. And as Tara was explaining, what people have done here is they've left, they've immigrated. Now under COVID, you don't do that. You're not going to be able to do that any longer. That's the end of that growth model for the time being, anyway. Not just for Zimbabwe, but for a whole lot of African countries and other countries around the third world that rely on remittances. It's not going to be the same in the future, unless until we have some resolution of this problem. So I'm not as optimistic about long term. I don't believe that natural resources, particularly in agriculture under climate change, are going to be a great boon. I do think that you know, we need to move upmarket into more technology intensive types of development. And then until we get that kind of model going, I think it's going to be a very hard slog. But so long as people believe, and I'm afraid they're outsiders who believe it, that Zimbabwe will double its per capita income within 10 years or something, well, you know, I'm afraid people are going to be disappointed.
And I've got a political question, just as or does anybody else want to say where next for the economy, or have we answered that question as good as we can right now? There's a demonstration on the 31st of July again. This is actually an anti-corruption demonstration. That's the one question I want to ask. You know, what could come out of that? Is there opposition to what's happening at the moment? And is there any chance of the military making another soft coup in Zimbabwe? I know that's provocative, but you're welcome to answer or not answer if you like.
So I'll take the political one. So, well, I mean, you know, when you are in a situation, what we do know about Zimbabwe's ruling class at the moment is that it's deeply divided. Everything about this closing of the stock market shows that. I think it shows also a desperation, probably a lack of funds, and an inability to meet the domestic demands on the government. So it's probably scrabbling around, but I also think it probably represents an area of disgruntlement and concern within the ruling elite. And when you've got that turbulence within, it's in an environment like Zimbabwe's, it is vulnerable to those sorts of activities, of those sorts of interventions that may be a soft coup or some such. It is, I would suggest, at a risk of that.
I would just add, I'll be surprised if the demonstration goes ahead, particularly in the light of the statement yesterday that President Mnangagwa is going to make a statement at the end of this week on tightening up the COVID-19 lockdown rules. I'm sure that it'll be very difficult for anyone to organize a demonstration. So I don't see it going ahead.
So like many other countries, the COVID-19 regulations are going to be used to stifle opinion and economy.
Linda, my points were more about sort of internal military intervention, your soft coup thing, rather than the debate. I agree with Tony that, you know, COVID emergency regs are a cover for all sorts of suppression, as we've seen right across the continent, from Egypt to Algeria, everywhere. So.
Okay. Well, anybody wants to make a last comment? We've got like a minute left.
Good, thanks.
Sean?
No, not me, thanks.
Just that one hopes that, I mean, all I can hope, but with this, as I always say, that there is a short, sharp shock, and that something, that the crisis is not just a continuing crisis, because it's been a crisis for a number of years now, and that something comes to a crescendo and a happy conclusion. But I'm not holding my breath.
Okay. Anybody else holding their breaths? No. Well, with that,
No.
we conclude our BizNews Midweek Catch-up webinar, Zimbabwean Crisis. Thank you so much to Professor Tony Hawkins and Sean Gammon, both in Harare. And thank you for speaking to us. As Tara mentioned, not many Zimbabweans are keen to show their faces and talk about some of these issues. Thank you, Tara O'Connor in London. And thank you, everybody, for the questions you asked. I'm sorry if some we didn't get to, but I tried to take some of them and put them together. And thank you, everybody, and bye.
Thank you.